Welcome to my channel.
The rain in Lochdubh did not so much fall as it did colonize. It was a fine, misty grey curtain that turned the mountains into ghosts and the sea loch into a basin of cold pewter. To a tourist it was atmospheric. To PC Hamish Macbeth it was the perfect excuse to do absolutely nothing. Hamish sat by the peat fire in the police station, his long, lanky frame draped over a chair that had seen better decades. His shock of ginger hair was slightly damp, and his hazel eyes were fixed with intense concentration, not on a case file but on the slow, rhythmic bubbling of a pot of coffee on the stove. Beside him, Lugs, his large-eared dog of uncertain pedigree, let out a long, shuddering sigh that mirrored his master's soul. The peace was absolute. The village of Lochdubh was tucked away in a fold of the Sutherland Mountains, far enough from the prying eyes of the Strathbane headquarters to allow a man to live a life of quiet dignity, which in Hamish's case involved a great deal of poaching and a minimal amount of paperwork. "It's a grand day for the fish, Lugs," Hamish murmured, "and a grand day for staying on the right side of the door. But the peace of the Highlands is a fragile thing, usually shattered by the arrival of someone with a suitcase and an attitude." The disruption arrived in the form of a silver Porsche that looked as out of place on the narrow, sheep-cluttered roads as a spaceship in a cow pasture. It roared into the village, spraying mud over the pristine white stones of the waterfront, and screeched to a halt outside the Lochdubh Hotel. Out stepped Julian Vane. Julian was a Sassenach of the most exhausting variety, a London property developer with teeth too white for the Scottish light and a wardrobe consisting of expensive tweed that had never seen a bramble. He had bought the old McRae cottage on the cliffside. He hadn't been in the village a week before he started complaining about the smell of the seaweed, the noise of the gulls, and the fact that the local grocery shop didn't stock organic avocados. Hamish had watched him from afar, hidden behind a stand of Scots pine while checking his lobster pots. He had seen Julian shouting into a mobile phone about investment potential and quaint, underdeveloped locals. The door to the police station creaked open, letting in a swirl of damp air and the unmistakable scent of expensive aftershave. Julian Vane stood there, looking at Hamish with the sort of disdain one usually reserves for a particularly slow-witted sheep. "Officer," Vane barked, "I assume you are the law enforcement here, if one can call it that." Hamish didn't move. He continued to watch his coffee. "I am PC Macbeth, sir, and you would be Mr. Vane." "I've been trying to sleep," Vane snapped, ignoring the introduction. "But for the last 3 nights, some local hooligan has been playing the bagpipes at midnight, right outside my property. It's a cacophony. I want it stopped. I want them arrested for disturbing the peace." Hamish looked up slowly, his face a mask of polite, vacant curiosity. "The pipes, you say? At midnight?" "Yes. High-pitched screeching. It sounds like a cat being put through a lawnmower." "That would be the Pioberecht," Hamish said softly, his voice thick with a deceptive Highland lilt. "It's the classical music of the pipes, Mr. Vane. Very difficult to master. Perhaps someone is just practicing." "In the dark, in the rain?" Vane sneered. "It's harassment. They're trying to drive me out. I've heard how you people treat incomers. Well, it won't work. I've paid $500,000 for that view, and I'll be silent if I have to buy the whole damn hill." "I'll look into it, sir," Hamish said, his eyes drooping as if the very effort of speaking was exhausting him. "When the weather clears, it's a long cliff walk, you see. My legs aren't what they used to be." Vane looked at Hamish's long, muscular legs and snorted. "Useless. Absolutely useless. I'll be writing to your superintendent in Strathbane. This village needs a real policeman, not a ginger daydreamer." He slammed the door. Hamish sighed and poured himself a mug of coffee. He knew the Midnight Piper wasn't a local legend or a restless spirit. It was a warning. In Lochdubh, when the pipes played at the wrong hour, it usually meant someone was about to be marched to a very different kind of tune. "He's a rude man, Lugs," Hamish whispered to the dog, "and rude men in the Highlands often find that the mountains have a very short temper." He took a sip of the bitter, hot liquid, feeling a prickle of unease. The midnight piper was a dark omen, and Hamish had a feeling his quiet day was about to be ruined by something much worse than a complaint about noise. The following morning the rain had ceased its aggressive assault, leaving behind a world draped in a thick, suffocating blanket of white mist. The hills had vanished entirely, and even the waters of the loch were invisible, though the rhythmic slap of the tide against the pier remained a constant, mournful heartbeat. Hamish Macbeth was up earlier than he liked, driven by a persistent gnawing in his stomach and the fact that Lugs had decided to celebrate the break in the weather by barking at a stray seagull at 6 in the morning. He sat at his small kitchen table, nursing a second pot of coffee and contemplating the sheer effort required to fry an egg when the telephone on the wall began to shrill with a frantic, jagged urgency. Hamish eyed the black plastic receiver with profound suspicion. In Lochdubh, a phone call at this hour rarely brought news of a lottery win or a friendly invitation to tea. It usually meant that a sheep had fallen down a crevice, or worse, that a human had done something equally foolish. He let it ring 4 times, hoping the caller might reconsider before he finally rose and lifted the receiver with a wary, "Lochdubh Police Station, PC Macbeth speaking." The voice on the other end was high-pitched and vibrating with a terror that cut through the Highland static. It was Mrs. Wellington, the minister's wife, a woman who prided herself on her iron nerves and her even more formidable sponge cakes. "Hamish, you must come at once. It's the Vane House, the new place on the cliff. I was out for my morning walk with the spaniels despite the fog, and I saw— Oh, Hamish, it's ghastly. It's truly wicked." Hamish felt the familiar heavy sinking sensation in his chest. His peaceful day, already compromised by the lack of eggs, was now officially deceased. "Calm yourself, Mrs. Wellington. What is it you've seen? Is it Mr. Vane? Has he had another row with the neighbours?" "It's Mr. Vane, aye," she gasped, her voice dropping to a horrified whisper. "But he's not rowing. He's decorated. On the gates, Hamish, like a trophy. Please hurry." Hamish hung up the phone and sighed, looking down at Lugs, who was already waiting by the door with his head cocked to one side. "Well, Lugs, it seems the Sassenach has managed to make himself the centre of attention again, though I doubt he'll be complaining about the pipes this morning." He pulled on his heavy greatcoat and his peaked cap, which sat slightly askew on his mop of red hair, and stepped out into the damp, clinging cold. The walk up the cliff path was steep and treacherous in the mist. The moisture turned the grass into a slick trap, and the smell of salt and rotting kelp rose from the hidden shore below. As he approached the wrought-iron gates of the investment property, the silhouette of a figure began to emerge from the whiteness. Julian Vane was indeed at the gates, but he was no longer the arrogant, posturing man who had invaded Hamish's station the night before. He was suspended from the ornate iron scrollwork by the back of his expensive tweed jacket, his feet dangling a good 6 inches off the ground. He looked like a discarded puppet, but it was the details that made Hamish stop in his tracks. Vane was dead, his face a mottled purple, his eyes wide and bulging as if he had seen something that quite literally took his breath away. But it was the decoration Mrs. Wellington had mentioned that sent a chill through Hamish that had nothing to do with the Highland weather. Tied around Julian Vane's neck, like a grotesque oversized bow, was a set of bagpipes. The long wooden drones were splayed out behind his head like the wings of a fallen angel, and the tartan bag was deflated against his chest. Even more bizarrely, a single dried salmon had been stuffed into the man's open mouth, the silver scales shimmering dully in the morning light. It was a scene of calculated dark theatre, a murder that was also a punchline. Hamish stood very still, his long nose twitching as he took in the scent of the air. Beneath the salt and the damp earth there was a faint, lingering trace of something sweet, like honey or heather wine. He didn't approach the body immediately. Instead, he looked at the ground. The gravel driveway had been scuffed, but the mist and the light rain from earlier had blurred any distinct footprints. "Aye, lugs," Hamish murmured, his voice low and thoughtful. "Someone had a very busy night, and they wanted us to know exactly why they did it. This wasn't just a killing, it was a critique. The symbolism was thick as fog, the pipes for the man who hated the noise, the salmon for the man who had complained about local poaching rights, the gate for the man who wanted to wall himself off from the village. It was a Highland welcome taken to a lethal extreme. Hamish felt a sudden sharp pang of annoyance. A murder this flamboyant wouldn't stay local for long. It meant the big men from Strathbane would be descending on Lochdubh like a swarm of locusts, bringing their sirens, their arrogance and their total lack of understanding for the nuances of village life. He saw Julian Vane's face again. The man had been terrified. There was no sign of a struggle on the body itself, no blood, no obvious wounds. It looked as though he had been hoisted up there while already unconscious or dead. Hamish reached out a gloved hand and touched the hem of the tweed jacket. It was soaked through, but the bagpipes were remarkably dry, as if they had been placed there only recently, after the worst of the night's rain had passed. "Someone stayed out in the dark," Hamish mused, "waiting for the rain to stop just to make sure the pipes looked their best. That's a very patient kind of hatred, lugs." A low rumble in the distance signalled the end of his brief period of quiet observation. It was the sound of a heavy engine straining up the hill. Hamish recognised the aggressive, impatient roar of a police van being driven by someone who didn't care about the suspension. DCI Blair was on his way. The peace of Lochdubh hadn't just been shattered, it was about to be trampled under the boots of the Strathbane CID. Hamish straightened his cap and adopted his most vacant, slightly confused expression. He slumped his shoulders and let his jaw hang just a fraction of an inch lower. By the time the blue lights began to pulse through the mist, PC Hamish Macbeth looked exactly like the useless rural constable the world expected him to be. He would let the big men shout and stomp. In the meantime, he would think about that smell of honey and why a man would die with a fish in his mouth while the midnight piper played his final silent note. The heavy metallic thud of a car door slamming echoed through the mist like a gunshot, announcing the arrival of Detective Chief Inspector Blair before his face even emerged from the whiteness. He stomped toward the gates of the Varney estate, his face already a shade of alarming crimson that suggested his blood pressure was currently a matter for medical science. Behind him trailed the usual retinue of weary-looking detectives, and a forensics technician who looked as though he would rather be anywhere else in the British Isles. Blair stopped short, his small, piggish eyes widening as they landed on the suspended, piper-clad corpse of Julian Vane. For a moment, the only sound was the heavy breathing of the DCI and the distant, mocking cry of a herring gull. "What in the name of the sweet Highland heavens is this?" Blair roared, his voice cracking with a mixture of fury and disbelief. He turned his gaze toward Hamish, who was standing a respectful distance away, leaning against a damp stone pillar, with a look of vague, pastoral bewilderment. "Macbeth, you've been standing here like a garden gnome for how long? Don't tell me you've let the locals turn a crime scene into a pantomime." Hamish blinked slowly, his hazel eyes wide and innocent. "I only just arrived myself, sir. Mrs. Wellington found him. I've touched nothing, though I did ensure the spaniels didn't get too close to the fish, sir." Blair stepped closer to the body, his boots crunching loudly on the gravel that Hamish had been so careful to avoid. He peered at the salmon wedged in Vane's mouth with a look of pure loathing. A fish, a set of pipes. He's practically wearing a tourist brochure. "This is a joke, Macbeth, a sick local joke. Some drunken hillbilly has taken a dislike to the Englishman and decided to make a statement. I want the name of every poacher in this glen, and I want them in the cells by lunchtime." "It's a very clean salmon, sir," Hamish offered mildly, ignoring the insult to his neighbours, "freshly taken from the loch. But pipes are interesting now. They're a good set. MacDougall drones, if I'm not mistaken. Not the sort of thing a man leaves behind if he's just looking to play a prank." Blair turned on him, his finger stabbing the air inches from Hamish's nose. "I don't need a lecture on woodwinds from a man who spends his days counting sheep. This is a high-profile victim. Julian Vane had friends in London, friends in the Scottish office, and here he is, hung like a side of beef on his own front gate. This is a PR disaster, and I won't have it bungled by some red-headed peasant who can't even keep his uniform pressed." He shoved past Hamish, nearly knocking him into the gorse, and began shouting orders at the forensic team. "Get him down, carefully. I want the pipes bagged, the fish bagged, and I want a footprint sweep of this entire driveway. And get that dog out of here. This is a crime scene, not a bloody kennel." Luggs gave a low, rumbling growl, but Hamish placed a calming hand on the dog's head. He watched as the team began the undignified process of lowering Julian Vane's body. It was a messy business. The tweed jacket was snagged firmly on the iron scrollwork. As they tugged at it, the bagpipes let out a long, mournful, wheezing groan, a final, ghostly note that seemed to hang in the damp air long after the bag had deflated. The sound made even the hardened Strathbane detectives jump, but Blair merely cursed louder. "It's a clear-cut case of local resentment," Blair declared, pacing back and forth in a tight circle. Vane was an outsider. He was loud. He was rich. The motive is as plain as the nose on your useless face, Macbeth. Who was he arguing with? Who's the village hothead? Is it that butcher McLean, or that old drunk who lives by the pier? Hamish looked down at his boots, seemingly lost in thought. "Mr. Vane had a way of rubbing people the wrong way, sir, it's true, but the folk here usually express their displeasure by ignoring a man or charging him double for a pint of milk. Murder it's a lot of work, sir, especially the lifting." He was a heavy man, and those gates are high. "Are you suggesting it was a professional hit?" Blair sneered, his lip curling. "A London gang followed him up here to dress him like a Scotsman? Don't be ridiculous. It's a local crime, and I'll find the local who did it. You, Macbeth, are to stay out of the way. I don't want you investigating. I don't want you talking to witnesses. You can go and direct traffic or whatever it is you do when you're not poaching. We'll take the hotel as our headquarters. Move." Hamish nodded obediently, his face a mask of dull compliance. "Whatever you say, DCI Blair. I'll just be on my way then. I wouldn't want to get in the way of such a thorough investigation." He whistled for Luggs and began to walk slowly back down the cliff path, his gait languid and relaxed. To any observer he looked like a man who had just been relieved of a heavy burden and was happy to return to his life of indolence. But as soon as he was out of Blair's sight, tucked behind a thicket of rowan trees, Hamish's expression shifted. The vacancy in his eyes vanished, replaced by a sharp, predatory intelligence. He hadn't mentioned the scent of honey to Blair. He hadn't mentioned that the salmon was a spring fish, despite it being the wrong season for such a specimen to be in the local waters. Most importantly, he hadn't mentioned that Julian Vane's shoelaces were tied in a double knot, a detail that didn't match the man's usual fastidious slip-on loafers. "Blair will look for a man with a grudge and a strong arm," Hamish whispered to Luggs as they reached the outskirts of the village. "He'll bully the fishermen and shout at the shopkeepers, but he won't ask why someone went to the trouble of playing the pipes at midnight for 3 days before they acted. He won't ask who in Lochdubh knows enough about the Piorbere to use it as a death march." The mist was beginning to lift, revealing the colourful houses of Lochdubh clustered around the harbour like a handful of spilled jewels. The village was waking up, and news of the Piper's Trophy would be spreading faster than a winter flu. Blair thought he could solve this with shouting and sirens, but Hamish knew better. To find the truth, one didn't need a forensic lab or a team of shouting men. One needed a hot pot of tea, a sympathetic ear, and the patience to wait for the village gossip to boil over. As he approached the back door of the Lochdubh Hotel, hoping to intercept the morning delivery of scones before Blair's team requisitioned the entire larder, Hamish felt the first real spark of the chase. The game was afoot, and though Blair had sidelined him, the Highlands had a way of keeping their secrets hidden from everyone except the man who belonged to the soil. The heavy boots of the Strathbane police had barely begun to scuff the floorboards of the Lochdubh hotel before Hamish Macbeth was making his exit through the kitchen service entrance. He knew the geography of the hotel better than any architect. He knew which floorboards creaked and which back doors remained unlocked for the early morning milk delivery. Avoiding the front lobby where Blair was currently barking orders at the terrified manager, Hamish slipped into the crisp morning air, his mind whirring beneath his calm ginger exterior. The DCI would spend the next several hours intimidating the obvious suspects, but Hamish knew that in the Highlands the truth was never found by shouting at it. It was found in the quiet spaces between a story and a lie, usually over a steaming cup of tea. His first stop was the post office, a cramped wood-panelled room that smelled of old paper, damp wool and peppermint. Mrs. Kennedy, the postmistress, was the unofficial clearinghouse for every secret within a 50-mile radius. She was currently leaning over the counter, her eyes bright with the feverish energy of a woman who had just seen the social event of the decade. As Hamish entered, the bell above the door gave a cheerful tinkle that seemed entirely at odds with the grim discovery on the cliff. "Is it true then, Hamish?" she whispered before he had even crossed the threshold. "A salmon in his mouth and the pipes around his neck, like a pagan sacrifice." Hamish leaned against the counter, his frame unfolding like a pocket knife. He looked tired, vulnerable, and exactly like a man who needed a bit of mothering. "It's a terrible business, Mrs. Kennedy. A black day for the village. And with the Strathbane men here, it's only going to get worse. DCI Blair is convinced it's one of our own. He's looking for a man with a temper and a grudge." Mrs. Kennedy snorted, her knitting needles clicking like a frantic clock. "A temper? Everyone had a temper when it came to Julian Vane. Did you know he tried to stop the public right of way through the old sheep track, claimed it disturbed his privacy? But it wasn't just the locals he was upsetting, Hamish. There was a woman, none of us mind you, a tall, elegant creature with hair like a raven's wing. She was at the hotel last week, asking very pointed questions about the boundaries of the Vane property." Hamish tilted his head, his hazel eyes narrowing slightly. "A stranger. Did she leave a name?" "Registered as a Mrs. Montgomery," Mrs. Kennedy said, lowering her voice further. "But she didn't act like Montgomery. Too much jewellery for a Tuesday morning. And she received a letter. I saw the return address while I was sorting the mail. It was from a legal firm in Edinburgh, Blackwood and Graves. Sounds like a funeral parlour, if you ask me." "It does indeed," Hamish murmured. He made a mental note of the name. "And what about the pipes, Mrs. Kennedy? There aren't many in the Glen who play the MacDougall drones anymore. Most use the cheaper modern sets." The postmistress paused, her needles silent. "Old Archie MacLean has a set of MacDougalls, but the poor soul can barely blow out a candle these days, let alone fill a bag with air. Although," she hesitated, looking toward the window, "his grandson Peter came back from the army last month. He's been seen wandering the hills late at night. Some say the war changed him. He was a champion piper before he left, you know." Hamish nodded slowly. Peter MacLean was a quiet lad, prone to long silences and longer walks. He was exactly the kind of person Blair would target, a local with the skill and the potential for a military-style execution. But Hamish couldn't see Peter stuffing a salmon into a dead man's mouth. It lacked the necessary malice. He bid Mrs. Kennedy a polite farewell, declining a second peppermint, and made his way toward the harbour. The mist had fully retreated now, leaving the village bathed in a deceptive, sparkling clarity. He found himself outside the curry shop, where the aroma of turmeric and toasted cumin fought a losing battle against the salty breeze. Patel, the owner, was sweeping the pavement with a vigour that suggested he was trying to erase the very memory of the morning's events. "A bad business for tourism, PC Macbeth," Patel said, leaning on his broom. "People come to the Highlands for the peace, not for the operatic murders. Mr. Vane was here only 2 nights ago. He was very rude about the spice level of the Vindaloo, said it was unauthentic. Then he spent an hour on the phone in the corner, arguing with someone about a missing inheritance and a midnight deadline." Hamish straightened his cap. A deadline? Did he seem frightened? Angry, more like, Patel responded. He kept saying, "You can't play that tune with me." I thought it was a figure of speech, but then the pipes started that very night, high up on the cliff. It sounded like a lament, Macbeth, a real old-fashioned lament. Hamish thanked him and moved on, his stomach letting out a treacherous growl. He realized he hadn't eaten since the previous night's stew. He redirected his steps toward the manse, knowing that the minister's wife, despite her shock at the gates, would have a pot of tea and a plate of scones, waiting for anyone who looked sufficiently official and sufficiently hungry. As he walked, Hamish chewed over information. A raven-haired woman, a legal firm in Edinburgh, a dispute over an inheritance, and a midnight deadline. The midnight piper wasn't just a nuisance, it was a ticking clock. Julian Vane hadn't been killed by a random local with a grudge. He had been executed by someone who understood the psychological weight of the Highlands, someone who knew that, in Lochdubh, a man's sins were often revisited upon him in the most theatrical of ways. He reached the manse and was greeted by the sight of Priscilla Halberton Smythe's sleek Volvo, parked in the driveway. Priscilla, the daughter of the local landowner, and the perennial object of Hamish's frustrated affections, was exactly the person he needed to see. She moved in the social circles Vane had aspired to join, and she possessed a razor-sharp intuition that matched his own. "The plot thickens, Lugs," Hamish whispered to the dog as they approached the front door. "We have the motives of the gentry mixed with the skills of the locals. And somewhere in the middle is a dead man who didn't know when to hold his tongue." He smoothed his hair and tried to look like he hadn't spent the morning avoiding his superior officer. He needed Priscilla's insight into the Sassenach world of property and greed, but he also needed to ensure that whatever they discussed didn't reach Blair's ears. If he was to save the village from the DCI's heavy-handed justice, he had to solve this case quickly, quietly, and with the kind of deceptive laziness that had become his trademark. Hamish stood on the doorstep of the manse for a moment, adjusting his tie and attempting to brush a persistent dusting of peat ash from his sleeve. Before he could even lift the heavy iron knocker, the door swung open to reveal Priscilla Halberton Smythe. She looked, as she always did, effortlessly composed in a tailored Barber jacket and a silk scarf that seemed to catch the very best of the morning's pale light. Her blonde hair was pulled back, emphasizing the fine, aristocratic lines of a face that had haunted Hamish's dreams and complicated his waking hours for more years than he cared to count. "I thought you might turn up here, Hamish," she said, her voice a cool, pleasant melody that nonetheless carried a hint of reproach. "Mrs. Wellington is in the parlour, currently being revived by a very stiff Earl Grey. She's been telling me about a installation at the Vane house. It sounds perfectly dreadful, even by Lochdubh standards." "It's a bad business, Priscilla," Hamish admitted, following her into the hallway while Lugs obediently flopped onto the welcome mat. "DCI Blair is up there now, trying to fit the crime to the nearest available locale. He's got his eyes on Peter McLean, and if I don't find him another path to follow, that lad will be in a cell before the sun sets." They stepped into the sun-drenched parlour where the minister's wife sat, her hands trembling slightly as she clutched a china cup. After a few minutes of Hamish's gentle, rhythmic questioning, a process that felt more like a cosy chat than an interrogation, Mrs. Wellington was escorted upstairs to rest. This left Hamish and Priscilla alone with a plate of scones that had, as if by magic, appeared on the low coffee table. "You don't think it was Peter, then?" Priscilla asked, pouring him a cup of tea. She didn't bother with sugar. She knew Hamish took enough to make a spoon stand upright. "Peter has the skill, but he lacks the theatre," Hamish said, taking a hearty bite of a scone. To hang a man like that, to find a spring salmon out of season, and to time the pipes for 3 nights prior, that takes a specific kind of imaginative malice. It's not just about killing Vane, it's about making him look like a fool in front of the whole Highlands. It's an insider's knowledge used by an outsider's mind. Priscilla leaned back, her grey eyes thoughtful. You might be right about the outsider part. Julian Vane wasn't just a property developer, Hamish. He was a man built on debt and very precarious social ladders. My father met him at a dinner in Edinburgh last month, and he said Vane was desperate. He was trying to sell that cliffside cottage before he'd even finished the renovations. He'd overextended himself, and he was looking for a quick exit. Hamish paused, a crumb of scone hovering near his lip. A quick exit? Then why was he fighting the locals over right-of-way and spice levels? Usually a man in a hurry tries to keep the water calm. Unless the fight was the point, Priscilla suggested, her voice dropping. If he could prove the locals were hostile, he might have been trying to trigger an insurance clause or a legal exit from a partnership. And speaking of partnerships, I heard something interesting at the club. Vane wasn't the sole owner of that property. He had a silent partner, a woman who recently inherited a substantial estate and was looking to launder her reputation through Highland real estate. Hamish thought of the Mrs. Montgomery the postmistress had mentioned, a raven-haired woman, wealthy, perhaps with a connection to a legal firm called Blackwood and Graves? Priscilla's eyebrows shot up. You've been busy, Hamish. Yes, Helena Montgomery. She's the widow of a Glasgow shipping magnate, but her maiden name was Macrae. Her family originally owned that very stretch of cliff before they were forced out during the clearances 2 generations ago. She's been obsessed with reclaiming the land, but Vane apparently tricked her into a contract that gave him all the development rights. She would have the soil, but he would have the profit. Hamish leaned forward, the tea forgotten. So we have a woman with a hereditary claim, a deep-seated grudge against the man who cheated her, and the money to hire someone who knows the local law. But would she know about the pipes? Would she know about the salmon? The Macraes were famous pirates, Hamish, Priscilla said softly. It's in her blood. If she wanted to punish Vane, she wouldn't just shoot him. She would want to humiliate him using the very traditions he mocked. Hamish sighed, rubbing his face with his large calloused hands. The romantic tension between them, usually a source of mild agitation, was momentarily eclipsed by the grim logic of the situation. He looked at Priscilla, realizing that once again she had provided the bridge between the village gossip and the cold reality of the world beyond the glen. Blair won't listen to a word of this, Hamish muttered. He's currently looking for a man with muddy boots and a thick accent. If I tell him about a wealthy widow in Edinburgh and a contract dispute, he'll tell me I've been reading too many sensationalist novels. Then don't tell him, Priscilla said, a small, knowing smile playing on her lips. Show him. But be careful, Hamish. If Helena Montgomery is behind this, she's not just a woman with a grudge. She's a woman who believes she's enacting justice. And that makes her far more dangerous than a common criminal. Hamish stood up, his mind already racing toward the next move. He had to find out where Helena Montgomery was staying, if she was still in the area, and he had to do it without Blair's team noticing his unauthorized inquiries. As he moved toward the door, he turned back to Priscilla. Thank you for the tea, Priscilla, and for the insight. It's a pity you aren't the DCI. We'd have much less shouting and much better biscuits. She laughed, a short silver sound that followed him out into the hall. Just don't get yourself killed, Hamish. It would be dreadfully boring in Lochdubh without you to complain about. Outside, the air had turned crisp, and the scent of wood smoke was beginning to drift from the village chimneys. Hamish whistled for lugs, his gait quickening. He had a name now and a motive that stretched back through generations of Highland history, but as he looked up toward the cliff where the Porsche still sat like a silver tombstone, he couldn't shake the feeling that he was missing one vital piece of the puzzle, something small, something petty, something that Julian Vane had said or done in his final hours that had truly sealed his fate. He needed to return to the village, to the mooching grounds of the local shops, and find out exactly what Vane had been doing at midnight before the piper started to play. The answer wasn't in the history books or the legal contracts. It was in the dirt, the gossip, and the things people didn't say when they thought the police were listening. The walk back from the manse toward the heart of Lochdubh was heavy with the scent of damp gorse and the low, persistent thrum of a village under siege. Hamish kept to the shadows of the stone dikes, his mind working through the threads Priscilla had handed him. Helena Montgomery, a woman with a bloodline and a grievance, certainly fit the theatrical profile of the murder. But as he crested the hill overlooking the harbour, the sight of a familiar blue and white police van parked aggressively outside the McLean cottage made his stomach tighten. DCI Blair was moving, and like a bull in a china shop, he was headed straight for the most fragile piece of evidence in the glen. Hamish quickened his pace, lugs trotting at his heels with a low, anxious whine. By the time he reached the small, whitewashed dwelling where Peter MacLean lived with his grandfather, a small crowd of villagers had gathered at a safe distance. Their faces were grim, their arms folded across their chests in that universal Highland gesture of silent, stubborn resistance. Blair was on the doorstep, his face a vivid violet, shouting at a young man who stood perfectly still, his back straight and his eyes fixed on the horizon. Peter MacLean was dressed in his old regimental sweater, his hands calloused and steady. "Don't you lie to me, you little thug!" Blair's voice carried the sound of waves. "We found the pipe case in your shed. And don't tell me you were just practicing at midnight. We've got witnesses who saw you walking the cliff path. You hated Vane because he tried to block your access to the hills, and you used your special skills to string him up like a festival decoration. Handcuff him, Anderson." Hamish stepped forward, making no effort to hide his presence this time. "Now, hold on a minute, DCI Blair. There might be a simpler explanation for a piper having a pipe case in his shed." Blair turned, his eyes bulging. "Macbeth, I told you to clear off. This boy has no alibi. The motive is plastered all over the village, and he has the physical strength to have hoisted Vane onto those gates. It's a closed case. He's going to Strathbane for questioning, and he won't be coming back for a long time." "Peter," Hamish said softly, ignoring Blair's sputtering, "were you up on the cliff last night?" Peter MacLean looked at Hamish, a flicker of something, gratitude or perhaps just recognition, passing through his tired eyes. "I was, Hamish, but I wasn't playing. I went there to find who it was. It's a disgrace playing the lament for the children just to annoy a man like Vane. It's a sacred tune. I wanted to tell them to stop." "And did you see them?" Hamish asked. "I saw a car," Peter said, his voice level. "A dark one, not a local car. It was parked in the lay-by near the old ruins. But when I got there, it was gone. And as for the pipes in my shed, those aren't mine. Mine are in the house. The ones the sergeant found are an old set missing a chanter reed. Someone must have put them there this morning." Blair let out a bark of derisive laughter. "Oh, how convenient. A mystery car and a planted set of pipes. You think I'm an idiot, Macbeth? He's a soldier. He's trained in stealth. He's the only one in this miserable village with the guts to do it." "He's not the only one who knows the cliff, sir," Hamish countered, his voice remaining deceptively calm. "And if you'd look closely at those pipes you found, you'd see they haven't been played in years. The bag is cracked, and there's a thick layer of dust in the drones. Peter is a champion piper. He wouldn't be caught dead with a set in that condition, and he certainly wouldn't use them to kill a man." "I don't care if they're made of gold or goatskin," Blair roared. "They link him to the crime. Take him away." As the detectives led a silent, dignified Peter toward the van, Hamish felt a surge of cold anger. Blair was blinded by his own desire for a quick arrest, ignoring the glaring inconsistencies that Hamish could see as clearly as the peaks of the Quillins. He watched the van speed away, the sirens wailing a discordant note against the peace of the afternoon. The villagers turned to look at Hamish, their eyes filled with a mixture of hope and accusation. He was one of them, yet he wore the uniform of the men who had just taken their own. "Go home, everyone," Hamish said, his voice carrying a new authority. "Peter will be back, I promise you that." He turned and walked away, not toward the station, but back toward the harbour. He needed to find the red herring that Blair had missed, the subtle clue that would shatter the DCI's fragile case. He recalled dry salmon in Vane's mouth. It was a spring fish, silver and sleek. But the local season was over, and the loch was currently yielding only the darker, leaner autumn stock. To get a fish like that, one would need a deep freeze or a connection to a very specific kind of supplier. He stopped at the edge of the pier, looking down into the clear, cold water. Something was bothering him about the midnight piper. Peter had said he went up to stop the noise, which meant the music had been playing while Peter was still in his bed. If Peter was the piper, he couldn't have been the witness. And if someone had planted the pipes in Peter's shed, they had to have known he was the most likely suspect. They were using the village's own culture as a camouflage. Hamish's eyes caught a glint of something trapped in the seaweed near the harbour wall. He knelt, reaching down with a long piece of driftwood to hook it. It was a small plastic tag, the kind used by high-end fishmongers to denote premium Highland catch. On the back in faded ink were the words, "Property of Blackwood Graves." The name hit Hamish like a physical blow. The legal firm Priscilla had mentioned wasn't just handling a contract, they were supplying the props for a murder. The red herring wasn't Peter McLean, it was the very idea that this was a local crime. Julian Vane hadn't been killed by a vengeful Highlander. He had been killed by the cold, calculating machinery of a city-bred greed that had dressed itself in tartan to hide its face. "Lugs," Hamish said, his voice a low growl of realization. "Blair is at the hotel celebrating a closed case, but we're going to find out why a lawyer's office is tagging salmon and who was driving that dark car in the lay-by. It's time we looked past the pipes and the fish and started looking at the money." He straightened his jacket, the lazy slouch of his shoulders momentarily replaced by a sharp, focused gait. He had to act quickly. If Helena Montgomery was behind this, she would be moving to finalize her claim now that Vane was out of the way. And in the Highlands, a final claim often required one more sacrifice before the silence returned to the hills. He had to find the link between the legal firm and the widow before Blair made Peter's arrest permanent. Hamish stood on the pier, the plastic fish tag clutched in his palm like a jagged piece of the truth. The harbour water lapped rhythmically against the stone, a sound that usually brought him peace but now felt like a countdown. He knew he had to move fast. DCI Blair was likely already halfway to Strathbane, preening himself for a press conference where he would announce the arrest of a dangerous local insurgent. If Hamish didn't find the real killer soon, Peter McLean's life would be dismantled by the cold gears of a system that preferred a convenient lie to a difficult truth. He whistled for lugs and set off toward the Lochdubh Hotel, not through the front door, where the remnants of the CID were packing up, but through the wooded path that led to the kitchen gardens. He needed a word with the one person in the hotel who saw everything and said nothing, Jessie, the head housekeeper. Jessie was a woman of formidable years and even more formidable silence, her face etched with the lines of a life spent witnessing the follies of tourists and the arrogance of the wealthy. Hamish found her behind the laundry shed, shaking out a heavy rug with a violence that suggested she was picturing Blair's face on the wool. She stopped when she saw Hamish, her eyes narrowing behind thick spectacles. She liked Hamish, mostly because he never did extra work for her, and occasionally brought her a brace of poached grouse, when the winter was particularly lean. "He's taken the McLean lad, hasn't he?" Jessie said, her voice like grinding stones. "That big man from the city. No more brains than a bag of hammers, that one." "He has, Jessie," Hamish said, leaning against the shed, "but I'm looking to bring him back. I need to know about the woman, the one staying here, Mrs. Montgomery. Did she have visitors? Specifically a man with a dark car and a penchant for expensive suits?" Jessie leaned on her rug beater, looking thoughtful. "She had a visitor, aye, but it wasn't a man in a suit. It was a man in a delivery uniform. At least that's what he wanted people to think. He came through the back 3 nights ago, carrying a large thermal crate. Said it was special provisions for the Montgomery suite. But when I went to turn down the beds later, that crate was in the bathtub, dripping with meltwater. And the smell, Hamish. It didn't smell like fancy chocolates. It smelled like the fish market." Hamish's mind flashed back to the silver salmon in Vane's mouth. "And the car, Jessie? Did you see what he was driving? A dark Range Rover, she said. Parked it right in the gorse bushes where the light doesn't reach. But I saw the logo on the door when he left. It wasn't a food company. It was a firm of estate managers from the south. Something and something Graves. Hamish felt the pieces clicking into place with a sickening thud. It wasn't Helena Montgomery who had pulled the trigger or the rope on Julian Vane. She was the motive, the owner of the bloodline, but the execution had been managed by the very people who were supposed to be protecting her interests. Blackwood and Graves weren't just lawyers. They were the architects of a land grab that required Vane to be removed and a local savage to take the blame. It was a double-edged sword. They would get the land for their client, and by framing a local they would ensure the village was too cowed to protest the subsequent development. "Thank you, Jessie," Hamish said, already turning to go. "You've a better eye for detail than the whole of the Strathbane CID combined." "Find the lad, Hamish," she called after him. "The Highlands have lost enough sons to the greed of others." As he walked back through the village, Hamish realised the motive wasn't just about the cliffside cottage or a historical grudge. It was about the missing inheritance Patel had mentioned. Julian Vane hadn't just been a developer. He had stumbled upon something during his renovations, something buried in the old Macrae cottage that proved Helena Montgomery didn't need a partnership with him at all. If Vane had found a deed or a hidden cache of value, he would have tried to blackmail the legal firm, and Blackwood and Graves, representing a woman who believed the land was her divine right, had decided that Vane was a liability they couldn't afford. The Midnight Piper hadn't been a ghost or a local prankster. It had been a professional, likely hired by the firm, using a recording or a skilled musician to drive Vane into a state of paranoid isolation. They wanted him to feel the village was against him, so that when he finally disappeared or turned up dead, the hostile local narrative would be pre-written. Peter MacLean had simply been the perfect fall guy, a man with the skill to play the part and the silence to look guilty. But where was the hidden motive's final proof? Hamish stopped by the old harbour wall, watching the rising tide. The villain wasn't Helena Montgomery. She was likely a puppet in this, a woman blinded by her own obsession. The real killer was the man who had delivered the fish, the man who had planted the pipes in Peter's shed, and the man who was currently probably sitting in a plush office in Edinburgh, waiting for the all-clear from DCI Blair. However, one detail nagged at him, the scent of honey. He had smelled it on the cliff, and he had smelled it again near the manse. It wasn't a Highland scent. It was the scent of a specific high-end tobacco, the kind favoured by a certain class of professional who thought they were invisible in the wilderness. He remembered seeing a man at the hotel bar the night before, a man who had looked too comfortable in the shadows, smoking a thin, dark cigar that had filled the air with that cloying, sweet aroma. He wasn't a delivery man, he was the estate manager. "He's still here, Lugs," Hamish whispered. "The job isn't finished. They've got the man arrested. But they haven't got the document Vane was using for blackmail. They need to find whatever Vane hid in that cottage before the estate is settled." Hamish knew he couldn't call Blair. The DCI would only scream and threaten him with a transfer to the Glasgow docks. He had to set his trap. He had to make the hunter feel like the prey. He turned his steps toward the hardware shop, his mind spinning a web of rumours. If the killer was still looking for something, Hamish would make sure he knew exactly where to find it. He needed to move the pieces of the game away from the innocent and toward the greedy. In the Highlands, the best way to catch a fox was to make him think the henhouse door had been left swinging in the wind. By the time the moon rose over Lochdubh that night, Hamish Macbeth would no longer be the lazy policeman. He would be the one playing the tune, and he intended to make sure the finale was one the firm of Blackwood and Graves would never forget. The sun began to dip behind the jagged peaks of the Sutherland Mountains, casting long bruised shadows across the village of Lochdubh. To anyone watching, PC Hamish Macbeth appeared to have finally succumbed to his natural state of lethargy. He was leaning against the sea wall, casually tossing pebbles into the water, while lugs chased imaginary rabbits in the tall grass. However, Hamish was doing anything but resting. He was waiting for the village telegraph, that invisible lightning-fast network of whispers, to do his work for him. Earlier that afternoon he had made a series of very public, very accidental stops. He had told the postmistress that he'd found a strange old leather folder hidden under a floorboard in the Vaney cottage, but had left it there until he could get a proper warrant. He had mentioned the same thing to the hotel barman, loud enough for the shadows to hear, adding that it looked like an old deed or a map that would make someone very rich or very worried. Now, as the twilight thickened into a deep indigo blue, the trap was set. Hamish knew the psychology of the greedy. They could never resist the urge to tidy up a loose end, especially one that could strip them of their prize. He whistled for lugs, his movements slow and deliberate, and began the long trek back up the cliff path. He didn't take the direct route. Instead, he wound through the thickets of birch and rowan, moving with the silent, ghost-like grace of a man who had spent his life outsmarting the local gamekeepers. He reached the Vaney cottage just as the first stars began to penetrate the Highland sky. The silver Porsche sat abandoned in the drive, a gleaming monument to a man who had run out of time. Hamish didn't enter the house. Instead, he circled around to the back, settling himself into a dense hollow of gorse and bracken that provided a perfect view of the rear entrance. He pulled a thermos from his coat pocket and poured a cup of lukewarm coffee, the steam rising in the chill air. Lugs huffed and settled at his feet, sensing the change in his master's energy. The silence of the Highlands at night is never truly silent. There is the rustle of the wind in the heather, the distant cry of an owl, and the rhythmic pulse of the sea below. But beneath it all, Hamish was listening for a different sound, the sound of city shoes on rural gravel. It happened shortly after midnight. A dark Range Rover, its lights extinguished, coasted into the lay-by a few hundred yards down the road. A door opened and closed with a soft, muffled thud. Minutes later, a figure emerged from the gloom, moving with a cautious, practiced efficiency. The man wasn't a local. He walked with the stiff, hurried gait of someone who viewed the wilderness as an enemy to be conquered. As the figure reached the back door of the cottage, a small focus beam of a penlight cut through the darkness. The light caught the man's profile. It was the estate manager from the hotel, the man with the scent of honeyed tobacco clinging to his expensive wool coat. The man didn't use a key. He produced a set of professional lockpicks, working with a speed that confirmed Hamish's suspicions. This was no lawyer's clerk. This was a fixer, a man hired to ensure that the interests of Blackwood and Graves remained untarnished by the messiness of the law. The door clicked open, and the man slipped inside. Hamish waited, his heart beating with a slow, steady rhythm. He needed the man to find the folder, which was actually nothing more than an old copy of the West Highland Free Press, wrapped in a dusty piece of oilcloth. He needed the killer to be caught with the evidence of his own desperation. Inside the cottage, the floorboards groaned under the intruder's weight. Hamish moved from his hiding spot, circling the house to the front entrance. He didn't want a confrontation in the dark, cramped quarters of the kitchen. He wanted the man out in the open, where the geography of the Highlands favoured the man who knew every rock and rabbit hole. He reached the front door and waited, leaning against the stone lintel as if he were waiting for a bus. He took a final sip of his coffee and tucked the thermos away. "It's a fine night for a stroll, is it no?" Hamish's voice drifted through the open window, calm and conversational. Traffic inside the house stopped instantly. The penlight went out. For a long moment there was a heavy, suffocating silence. Then the front door burst open. The man didn't come out with his hands up. He came out like a cornered animal, a heavy metal pry bar clutched in his hand. He skidded to a halt when he saw Hamish standing there, illuminated by the pale moonlight, looking every bit the bumbling village bobby. "You!" the man hissed, his breath coming in short, jagged gasps. "The ginger idiot from the station. You should have stayed in bed, Macbeth." "And you should have picked a better fishmonger," Hamish replied, his voice hardening. The tag you dropped at the harbour was a bit of a giveaway, that and the smell of those cigars. They're very distinctive. My grandmother used to say that a man who smells like a beehive usually has a sting in his tail. The man looked down at the oilcloth bundle in his left hand, then back at Hamish. The realization that he had been tricked washed over his face, turning his features into a mask of pure murderous rage. You think you've won? You're a one-man show in a village at the end of the world. Who's going to believe you? By the time your fat DCI gets back here, I'll be long gone, and that document, and you, will be at the bottom of the loch. He lunged forward, the pry bar swinging in a wide, lethal arc. But Hamish wasn't there. He had stepped to the side with a fluid, deceptive speed that the man hadn't expected. The intruder stumbled, his momentum carrying him toward the edge of the gravelled plateau. He turned, snarling, but Hamish was already moving toward the gate, leading him away from the house and toward the steep, slippery path that led down to the sea. "Come on then, man," Hamish challenged. His Highland lilt vanished, replaced by a cold, sharp authority. "Let's see how your city feet handle a real Scottish cliff in the dark." The chase was on. The killer, fueled by adrenaline and the fear of a lifetime in prison, tore after him. He didn't see the loose scree or the patches of slick moss that Hamish navigated by instinct. He saw only the red hair of the policeman disappearing into the mist. Hamish was setting the final stage of the trap, leading the fox toward the one place where a stupid policeman became the master of his own domain. The killer scrambled after Hamish, his breath hitching in his chest as the thin Highland air burned his lungs. He was a man of the gymnasium and the paved street, and he found the shifting, treacherous terrain of the cliffside to be a nightmare of unseen obstacles. Every time he thought he was closing the distance, that shock of ginger hair would vanish behind a jagged outcrop of rock or a stand of stunted, wind-whipped pine. Hamish Macbeth was no longer the slow-moving constable who seemed to struggle with the weight of his own limbs. He was a shadow in the mist, moving with a terrifying, silent economy of motion that suggested he knew exactly where every stone and root lay hidden in the dark. "Stop, you ginger bastard!" the man screamed, his voice cracking against the roar of the surf below. He swung the pry bar blindly at a shadow, but his feet slid on a patch of wet lichen, and he went down hard on one knee. The pain was sharp, but the fear was sharper. He now realized he had made a catastrophic error in judgment. He had looked at Hamish and seen a relic of a dying world, a man easily brushed aside by modern ruthlessness. He hadn't realized that the Highlands didn't breed weak men, they bred patient ones. Hamish reappeared 10 yards ahead, standing on a narrow shelf of rock that overhung the churning waters of the loch. The mist swirled around him, making him look like a vengeful spirit of the glen. He wasn't panting, and his eyes were cold and fixed. "The game is finished, Mr. Graves, or whatever your real name is," Hamish said, his voice cutting through the wind with the precision of a blade. "You killed Julian Vane because he found the original McRae deed in the walls of that cottage, a deed that proved your firm had been defrauding Helena Montgomery for years. You didn't do it for her, you did it to cover your own tracks. And you thought you could blame a lad like Peter because he had the misfortune of being a better man than you'll ever be." The man scrambled to his feet, his face twisted in a snarl. He didn't care about the deed or the logic anymore. He only cared about the witness standing in his way. "I'm going to kill you, Macbeth, and then I'm going to walk back to that car and drive out of this god-forsaken heap of rocks forever." He lunged again, but this time he didn't swing the bar. He reached into his coat and pulled out a heavy, snub-nosed revolver. The moonlight glinted off the barrel, a sudden lethal intrusion of modern violence into the ancient silence of the cliff. Hamish didn't flinch. He knew the man's hands were shaking from exhaustion and adrenaline. A pistol in the hands of a panic man at 20 paces in a Highland gale was a gamble, but Hamish had spent his life stalking deer in the high corries. He understood the wind better than the man holding the trigger. "You'll miss," Hamish said simply. "And before you can cock that hammer again, Lugs will have the throat out of you." As if on cue, a low guttural growl vibrated through the air. It didn't come from in front of the man, but from directly behind him. Lugs had circled around through the bracken, his hackles raised, his teeth bared in a display of primal ferocity that froze the killer's blood. The man spun around, the gun waving wildly between the dog and the policeman. He was trapped between a vertical drop into the Atlantic and two predators who belonged to this land. "Put it down," Hamish commanded, stepping forward. "The Strathbane police are already on their way. I called them before I left the village. If you fire that weapon, you're not just a murderer, you're a dead man. Peter McLean's friends won't wait for a trial if they hear you've harmed a hair on my dog's head." It was a lie, of course. Blair was likely snoring in a hotel bed 10 miles away. The only backup Hamish had was the wind and his own wits, but the man didn't know that. He looked at the vast, indifferent darkness of the mountains and the unrelenting sea, and he felt the sheer weight of the Highlands pressing down on him. He was an interloper, a parasite who had tried to play at being a predator in a place that didn't recognize his authority. His hand wavered. The gun lowered an inch, then 2. In that split second of hesitation, Hamish moved. He didn't run, he launched himself like a coil of spring steel. He closed the distance before the man could return the revolver. Hamish's large, calloused hand clamped over the man's wrist with the strength of a smith's vice, twisting it upward. A sharp crack echoed off the rocks, followed by a scream of agony as the gun clattered to the stones. Hamish didn't stop there. He used his shoulder to drive the man back against the rock face, pinning him with a physical power that belied his lanky frame. "That was for the salmon," Hamish hissed, his face inches from the killer's, "and this is for the pipes." He delivered a short, sharp blow to the man's midsection that folded him like a piece of damp cardboard. The intruder slumped to the ground, gasping for air, his expensive coat ruined and his pride shattered. Hamish calmly picked up the revolver and tucked it into his pocket, then retrieved the oilcloth bundle the man had dropped. He looked down at the defeated figure, who was now weeping softly into the dirt. There was no triumph in Hamish's expression, only a profound weariness. He had saved the village from a grave injustice, but the peace of Lochdubh had been stained regardless. He whistled for Lugs, who came trotting over to sit beside him, looking quite pleased with himself. "You're a mess, man," Hamish said, looking at the intruder. "You've got gorse in your hair and the fear of God in your eyes. It's a pity. You could have just stayed in Edinburgh and stolen money the honest way, through legal fees." He pulled out a pair of old, slightly rusty handcuffs he'd carried in his pocket since his days in the Glasgow force. He snapped them onto the man's wrists with a satisfying click. The confrontation was over. The midnight piper would play no more, and the silver salmon would remain a story told over pints in the hotel bar for years to come. But as Hamish looked back toward the lights of the village, he realized his work was only half done. He still had to deal with DCI Blair, and he had to do it in a way that didn't involve a promotion. If he was hailed as a hero, he'd be transferred to a desk in the city within a month. He needed to find a way to make sure the credit went to the loudest, most incompetent man in the Highlands. "Come on, Lugs," Hamish sighed, starting the slow walk back down the cliff, hauling the prisoner behind him. "We've a long night ahead of us. We have to make a genius out of a fool, and that's a harder job than catching a murderer any day of the week." The mist began to thin as they descended, revealing the harbour once more. The water was calm, reflecting the stars like 1,000 tiny lanterns. The Highlands had reclaimed their silence, and for PC Hamish Macbeth, that was the only reward that truly mattered. He would have to endure Blair's shouting and the paperwork that was sure to follow, but as long as he could stay in his small station with his dog and his coffee, he would consider the price well worth paying. He glanced at the bundle in his hand, the fake deed, and smiled. The real one, he knew, was still hidden exactly where Julian Vane had left it, It would stay there until Hamish decided the time was right for Helena Montgomery to learn the truth about her loyal estate managers. As they reached the road, the first distant pulse of blue lights appeared on the horizon. Blair was coming, but for once Hamish was looking forward to the noise. He had a story to tell, and he was going to make sure it was a version that left him exactly where he wanted to be, forgotten in the beautiful, rain-soaked isolation of Lochdubh. The blue lights of the Strathbane police vans sliced through the Highland mist, casting rhythmic, garish streaks across the ancient stone of the harbour. As the vehicle screeched to a halt, DCI Blair tumbled out, his face a mask of irritable confusion, followed by two bleary-eyed detectives. He looked at the scene before him, Hamish Macbeth standing calmly with his hand on a shivering, handcuffed prisoner who was covered in mud and gorse needles, and for a moment the great Blair was actually speechless. Hamish, seeing the opportunity for his own salvation, immediately adopted a look of wide-eyed, slightly frantic admiration. He let his jaw go slack and allowed a tremor of relief to enter his voice, playing the part of the overwhelmed village constable to perfection. "Oh, thank goodness you're here, sir," Hamish cried out, his Highland lilt thickening until it was almost a caricature. "It was just like you said. Your strategy was a masterpiece of detective work. I followed your instructions to the letter, staying by the cottage and waiting for the pressure of your brilliant investigation in the village to flush the real villain out. It happened exactly as you predicted, DCI Blair. This man, this city fellow here, panicked because he knew you were closing the net on the legal firm. He came back to destroy the evidence, and I only just managed to catch him because he tripped over his own feet in his haste to escape your reach." Blair blinked, his chest beginning to puff out like a territorial pigeon. He looked at the prisoner, then at the revolver Hamish was gingerly holding out by the barrel, and finally at his own subordinates. The idea that he had masterminded a pressure tactic that successfully flushed out a professional assassin was a story far too enticing to reject. "Of course, Macbeth," Blair blustered, stepping forward to take the revolver with a gloved hand. "Did you think I was just screaming for it? I knew the local lad was a red herring, a necessary distraction to make the real killer feel overconfident. I sent you up here specifically because I knew your lack of presence would make him think the coast was clear." Hamish nodded vigorously, looking at the ground with a deceptive humility that masked a sharp internal tally of his success. "It was a stroke of genius, sir. Moving Peter McLean to the cells was the perfect feint. This man here, a Mr. Graves from the city, thought he was safe. I found the papers he was after, sir, and I'm sure once your team in Strathbane gets a look at the bank accounts of Blackwood and Graves, you'll be the talk of the Commissioner's office. You've cracked a major conspiracy, sir. They'll likely be wanting to give you a medal for this one." Blair's eyes gleamed with the predatory light of a man who could already see his name in the headlines of the Strathbane Gazette. "A medal? Well, perhaps a commendation. It was a matter of psychological profiling, Macbeth. Something you'll learn if you ever make it past the rank of constable, which, looking at the state of your trousers, seems unlikely. Anderson, get this piece of filth into the van, and find out where he stashed that Range Rover. I want a full forensic sweep on it immediately." The detectives moved with newfound energy, bolstered by the fact that they wouldn't have to spend another night in the damp Highlands. As they bundled the silent, defeated Graves into the back of the van, Blair turned back to Hamish, his expression shifting from triumph to a suspicious, lingering doubt. "And what about you, Macbeth? I suppose you'll be wanting a mention in the report for assisting me." Hamish looked horrified, as if Blair had suggested he take a bath in the icy loch. "Oh, no, sir. Please, sir, I wouldn't want to be bothering the higher-ups. In fact, if you could just leave my name out of it entirely, I'd be much obliged. You know how it is in the village. If people think I'm a hero, they'll expect me to start wearing a clean shirt every day, and maybe even doing some actual patrolling. It would be a terrible burden, sir. I'm quite happy just being your eyes and ears on the ground, so to speak." Blair snorted, a sound of pure derision that was music to Hamish's ears. Typical, no ambition, No drive, just a lazy red-headed peasant who wants to hide in the heather. Fine then, I'll take the credit since the heavy lifting was mine anyway. You just stay here and try not to lose your hat, and make sure the McLean boy is released with a stern warning about having a suspicious shed. Yes, sir. Thank you, sir. Hamish stood at a mock salute as the police van roared back toward the main road, its sirens silent this time, as if the victory was too dignified for such noise. He watched the tail lights disappear into the mist, and only then did he allow his shoulders to slump and the sharp, intelligent spark to return to his eyes. Lugg sat beside him, letting out a short, sharp bark that sounded suspiciously like a laugh. "That's that, Luggs," Hamish whispered, reaching down to scratch the dog's oversized ears. "Blair gets his promotion, the village gets its peace, and we get to keep our job. It's a fair trade, I suppose, even if I have to listen to that man's name on the radio for the next month." The immediate threat of being transferred to a bustling, smog-choked precinct in Glasgow had evaporated. By giving Blair the glory of a complex, conspiracy-busting arrest, Hamish had ensured that he remained exactly where he was, a seemingly useless, slow-witted constable in a backwater village that the central office would happily forget about for another year. He had protected the innocent, punished the greedy, and managed to stay invisible in the process. It was a perfect Highland solution. He turned back toward the village, the adrenaline of the confrontation finally fading into a deep, hollow hunger. He thought of the real deed, still tucked away in the stone wall of the cottage, and the secret he now held over the firm of Blackwood and Graves. They wouldn't be bothering Lochdubh again. They would be too busy trying to keep their partners out of prison once the financial investigators started digging into the trail Blair was about to discover. As he walked down the cliff path for the final time that night, Hamish felt the cool, salt air fill his lungs. The Midnight Piper was a memory, the Sassenach developer was a tragedy of his own making, and the salmon was likely already being processed as evidence in a cold Strathbane locker. The world was returning to its proper axis. He looked forward to a pot of tea, a thick slice of Mrs. Wellington's cake, and a long, uninterrupted sleep without the sound of bagpipes or sirens. "I think we've earned a bit of poaching tomorrow, Luggs," Hamish murmured. "Maybe a nice trout for the pan." After all, a man can't live on justice alone, especially when he's spent the whole night making a fool look like a hero. The village of Lochdubh slept unaware of the drama that had played out on its doorstep. The mountains stood tall and silent, guarding the secrets of the glen, and PC Hamish Macbeth, the smartest man in the Highlands who was determined to never let anyone know it, walked home through the mist, a shadow among shadows, perfectly content with his lot in life. The snow, which had been a chaotic fury just 24 hours earlier, now lay in a peaceful, undulating blanket across Lochdubh, turning the village into a scene from a Victorian Christmas card. The television vans had vanished as quickly as they had arrived, leaving behind only the deep ruts of their tires in the slush. The silence that followed was profound, the kind of silence that only returns once the experts from the south have finished explaining the Highlands to the Highlanders. Hamish sat in his small kitchen, the air thick with the comforting, savoury aroma of a mutton stew that had been simmering on the stove for hours. Luggs was stretched out across the threshold, his chin resting on his paws, watching a single fat bluebottle that had miraculously survived the frost. The police station was quiet, the black telephone remained blessedly silent, and the heavy stack of paperwork Blair had left behind was currently serving as a very effective draft excluder beneath the back door. A light tap at the door heralded the arrival of Priscilla Halberton Smythe. She didn't wait for an invitation, stepping into the warmth and unwinding a silk scarf from her neck. She looked at the pot of stew, then at Hamish, who was busying himself with two mismatched bowls. "I see you're celebrating your failure with your usual extravagance, Hamish," she said, her voice teasing but underlined with a genuine warmth. My mother is in a state of grace now that Blair has been officially credited with the arrest. She thinks it reflects well on the hotel's reputation to have been the stage for such high-level detective work. "It's important to keep the gentry happy, Priscilla," Hamish replied, ladling the thick broth into the bowls. "And it's even more important to keep the CID at a safe distance. If Blair thinks he's the hero, he'll spend the next 6 months giving lectures in Strathbane and leave us to our sheep." Priscilla sat at the small wooden table taking a piece of crusty bread. "And what about the Curry land? I heard the lawyers are already arguing over the lineage papers you found. Without Vane to push the development through, the Colonel says the project is as dead as a salt herring." Hamish sat opposite her, his expression unreadable. The land has a way of looking after itself. Angus might be in a cell, but he stopped the bulldozers. There's a bit of a tragedy in that, surely. A man who loved the soil so much he had to lose his freedom to save it. "You're a romantic, Hamish Macbeth," Priscilla said, watching him over the rim of her bowl. "A lazy, manipulative romantic. You know Elspeth is writing a book about the gnome killer. She's convinced there was a secret mastermind behind it all, someone pulling the strings from the shadows." Hamish let out a short, dry laugh. "Let her write. It will give tourists something to read while they're waiting for the rain to stop. In this village, the only masterminds are the ones trying to figure out how to get a free dram at the hotel bar." They ate in a comfortable silence, the only sound the ticking of the grandfather clock and the occasional pop of a peat ember in the stove. For a moment, the complexities of his life, the pull of the city, the demands of the force, and the tangled threads of his heart seemed to settle into a rare alignment of peace. He had done his job, even if no one would ever officially know it. He had protected his own. As Priscilla rose to leave, she paused by the door, resting a hand on Hamish's arm. "You won't be able to hide forever, you know. One day a case will come along that even you can't gift wrap for Blair." "Maybe," Hamish said, walking her to the door. "But until then I think I'll just see if the salmon are moving in the lower burn. It would be a pity to let a grand night like this go to waste." After she had gone, Hamish stood on his doorstep for a long time, looking out over the loch. The water was as dark as obsidian, reflecting the first few stars of the evening. The air was chewy but clean. He whistled for Lugs, who trotted out to join him, sniffing the air for the scent of a wandering rabbit. "Well, Lugs," Hamish whispered, pulling his deerstalker tight, "the Sassenachs are gone. The minister is praying for his soul instead of his bank balance, and we've had enough stew for 3 days. I'd say the law has been upheld, wouldn't you?" Lugs let out a short, sharp bark of agreement. Hamish closed the door, the click of the latch echoing in the still night. He was home, he was staying, and in the small, shadowed world of Lochdubh that was the greatest victory of all.